The moment the door swung open, the air in the room seemed to freeze. She recognized that scent. It was a perfume blending jasmine and tuberose, so cloyingly sweet it took her breath away. Exactly the same as the scent wafting from the row of glass bottles on her sister Emilia's dressing table. And now, that scent was surging out from the depths of the bedroom, like a hand clamping down on her throat. Lillian stood in the doorway, still holding the tray with a freshly brewed cup of black tea. This was her nightly routine, bringing her husband a cup of tea, knocking on the door, hearing that cold come in, then setting down the cup and leaving. She had been doing this for a full year. The Duke of Cassius Blackwood never so much as glanced at her, and she had grown accustomed to it. After all, this marriage had never been what he wanted. It was a political burden forced upon him by the old king's decree. She was nothing more than a substitute for her elder sister, a second daughter of the Blackwood family, from a collateral branch, with no claim to the inheritance, whose dowry was so meager it drew snickers throughout the palace. But she cared. She cared desperately, because ever since she first saw him at a royal banquet when she was 16, she hadn't been able to take her eyes off him. Those deep gray eyes were like a winter lake, cold, devoid of warmth, yet she had plunged headfirst into them. So when the king decreed that the Blackwood family must marry into the duke's house, and her sister Emilia wept that she had found another love, she stepped forward and said, "I will." At the time, she believed that if she gave him enough time, if she remained quiet enough, obedient enough, good enough, he would eventually glance her way. Now, she truly saw him. Through the half-open bedroom door, she saw the black gown scattered on the floor, the pearl necklace draped over the back of a chair, a gift her sister had received on her 18th birthday, the only one of its kind in the world, and then she saw the two bodies entwined on the bed. Cassius leaned against the headboard, his dark hair falling messily across his forehead, half his face buried in the crook of Emilia's neck. His eyes were slightly narrowed, like those of a sated beast, an expression she had never seen on him before. Throughout their entire year of marriage, he had looked at her as if she were a piece of cumbersome furniture. But now he was clutching her sister's waist, his knuckles turning white, as if he were trying to squeeze her right into her bones. The tray slipped from her hands. The white porcelain teapot crashed onto the marble floor, shattering into dozens of pieces, and scalding tea splashed onto the hem of her skirt. The sound was so sharp it felt as though it had shattered every pane of glass in the world. The two people on the bed looked up at the same time. A flicker of panic crossed Emilia's face, but it lasted only a moment. The next second, the corners of her mouth turned up, and that smile carried something Lillian had known since childhood: contempt. She'd always been like that, from the time she was a child, always having to take everything by force, and once she'd taken it, she'd stomp on it just to watch Lillian suffer. Cassius, however, merely furrowed his brow slightly. He didn't even push the person in his arms away. He simply leaned against the headboard, his gray eyes looking at her over Emilia's shoulder, his gaze as calm as if he were looking at a stranger who had suddenly barged in. "Lillian," he said, his voice cold. "Get out." Just 2 words. No explanation, no remorse, not even a hint of panic. She opened her mouth, but it felt as if someone had stuffed a wad of cotton down her throat. Not a single word came out. Her vision blurred, but it wasn't until the very last second that she realized it was tears. She couldn't cry here. Absolutely not. She was already low enough in this man's eyes. If she cried now, she'd never be able to hold her head up again. So she turned and ran. She didn't run far, dashing from the master bedroom on the 3rd floor to the estate's main gate, through the hallway lined with 12 portraits of the Blackwood ancestors, pushing open the oak door heavy enough to crush a man, and plunging headfirst into the rain. She hadn't even grabbed a coat. The early autumn rain was bone, chilling, stinging her face like fine needles. Barefoot on the gravel path, she didn't feel the cuts on the soles of her feet, for the pain in her heart was greater than anything else. That night, Lillian Blackwood vanished from the Duke's estate. No one knew where she had gone. The next day, the servants found only a trail of wet footprints and a mud-stained skirt on the floor of her room. Cassius stood in that empty room for a long time, then turned and left without saying a word. Emilia moved into the estate that very day, slipped into a silk nightgown, and strolled through the garden on the Duke's arm, smiling like a cat that had finally caught a mouse. That should have been the end of it. An inconsequential stand, in bride, her heart broken after catching her husband in an affair with her sister, would have vanished into the footnotes of history. No one would remember her. Cassius Blackwood remained the iron-fisted duke, who wielded immense power over the court, and commanded a third of the kingdom's army. Who stood by his side had never mattered. But fate has a knack for stabbing people in the back, just when they're at the height of their success. 4 years later, Everton, a small town on the northern border, was shrouded in wind and snow year, round so remote that it barely appeared on any map. On the outskirts of town stood a small stone cottage, its chimney emitting a wisp of white smoke, with a few pots of dried flowers arranged on the windowsill. Behind the house lay a pine forest bent under the weight of snow, and in front a stream half frozen over. It was a corner of the world, so quiet it seemed forgotten. That evening, a jet-black carriage crunched through the snow and came to a stop in front of the stone house. The carriage door opened, and the sound of leather boots hitting the snow echoed dully. Cassius Blackwood wore a heavy black coat. The mink trim at the collar was blown up by the wind, framing his face, which looked as cold as a sculpture dug from the permafrost. 4 years had etched deeper lines into his face. The shadows beneath his brow were darker, and his lips were pressed into a razor sharp line. He was more silent than before, and more dangerous. 2 attendants followed behind him, but they both had the sense to stop 10 paces away. The person his grace sought was not someone they could approach. Cassius stood before the stone house, staring at the wooden door. His hands were already clenched into fists inside his pockets. For the past 4 years, he had scoured the entire kingdom, mobilizing every influence at his disposal, from the capital to the borderlands, from noble estates to the slums, leaving no stone unturned. Then, just 3 days ago, he received a confidential report. The North, Everton, a woman named Mary Gray. Though the accompanying portrait was blurry, he recognized her at a glance. Those eyes, he had seen them countless times in his dreams. He took a deep breath and raised his hand to knock. His knuckles struck the wood, producing a muffled sound like a heartbeat. A flurry of light footsteps came from inside. Then the door creaked open. A woman's voice drifted out, carrying a hint of warmth scattered by the wind. "Who is it in this heavy snow?" Her voice trailed off. She froze in place. Lillian stood in the doorway, wrapped in an old wool cardigan, her hair casually braided and hanging over her shoulder. 4 years had changed her a great deal. Her cheeks were leaner than before, the line of her jaw more defined, and a few fine lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes. But she exuded a sense of calm she'd never possessed before. That aura was like a wall, keeping him on the outside. Her pupils contracted sharply the moment she saw him, and her fingers instinctively clenched the doorframe, as if ready to slam the door shut at any moment. But before she could move, a high-pitched, childish voice rang out from inside the house. "Mommy, who's here?" A tiny head peeked out from behind her legs. Black hair, gray eyes, and a chubby face speckled with breadcrumbs. It was a little boy about 3 years old, wearing a blue sweater with crooked sleeves. He clutched a half-eaten cookie in his hand, tilted his head back, and stared curiously at the stranger standing in the doorway. The air went completely still in that moment. Cassius's gaze shifted from Lillian's face, slowly drifting downward to rest on the child's face. He saw those gray eyes, exactly the same shade of gray as his own. the kind passed down through generations of the Blackwood family, the color of a winter lake. His pupils flinched violently, and he froze in place as if struck by lightning, the composure on his face shattering layer by layer to reveal something beneath that even he couldn't quite put into words. Lillian reacted faster than he did. She snatched the child up into her arms, took 2 steps back, and stood there like a cat with its fur standing on end, every pore in her body screaming, "Get lost." "Cassius," her voice trembled, but she stared him down, her eyes burning like 2 flames. "How the hell did you find this place?" He didn't answer. His lips moved, his Adam's apple bobbed once. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse as if sanded by grit. "He's mine." Not a question, a statement. The little boy was perched on Lillian's shoulder, tilting his head to look at this familiar stranger. He chewed his cookie twice and mumbled, "Mommy, who is he?" Cassius heard the word, "Mom." His face turned pale at a visible pace, and a vein on his temple throbbed. 4 years. She had vanished for 4 whole years, taking with her everything he had never known. He had waited year after year in an empty estate, driving away the woman who was meant to be his wife, and then, fate hurled every debt back at him, all at once. He didn't move. Snow fell on his shoulders, piling up in a thin layer, yet he stood there at the doorway as if completely oblivious to the cold, his gray eyes fixed intently on the child. Those hands that had gripped a sword for years and signed countless life and death pacts hung at his sides, trembling slightly. Lillian saw his trembling. But what welled up in her heart was not pity. It was hatred, a searing hatred that had been buried deep within her for 4 long years. She clutched the child in her arms and backed up to the table, one hand groping across the surface until her fingertips brushed against a small bread knife. She didn't know if she would actually strike, but the cold touch gave her a little courage. "You have no right to say that," she ground out through clenched teeth. "Cassius, get out of here right now." He didn't leave. He took a step inside. His leather boots scraped against the rough stone floor, bringing in a puddle of melted snow. The stone cottage was small, a bed, a table, a wood-burning fireplace, and a few wooden crates piled in the corner. The air carried the scent of burnt bread and the clean fragrance of burning pine. The smell made his chest tighten. It was the smell of home, something he had never possessed. The little boy peered over his mother's shoulder, his round gray eyes fixed on the tall stranger. Suddenly he grinned, revealing 2 tiny front teeth. "You look just like me," he said in a babyish voice, with the innocence unique to a 3-year-old. Cassius's breath caught in his throat. Something seemed to block his throat. His Adam's apple bobbed violently twice, and his lips parted and closed. This man, who could order the hanging of traitors in the court without batting an eye, who could strangle a warhorse with one hand on the battlefield, had just had all his defenses breached by a thoughtless remark from a 3-year-old. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice so hoarse it was barely audible. Lillian didn't answer. She set the child down on the floor, crouched down, cupped his little face in her hands, and whispered, "Lorn, go play in the inner room, close the door, and don't come out until Mommy calls you. Do you hear me?" The little boy tilted his head, looking at her, and then at the motionless man by the door. He furrowed his tiny brow, as if pondering a very complicated question. Then he stood on tiptoe and planted a kiss on Lillian's cheek, smearing cookie crumbs all over her face. "Okay," he said, turning and scampering into the back room, where he slammed the door shut. The moment the door closed, Lillian stood up. Her body was still trembling, but her gaze was no longer that of the girl who had known only flight 4 years ago. She walked toward him, close enough to smell the crisp scent of pine needles on his coat, a scent that had once made her heart flutter countless times. In those fleeting moments when he'd occasionally pass her on his way from the study, the hem of his coat brushing against the back of her hand. But now it only made her feel sick. "What do you want?" She tilted her head back to look at him, her jaw clenched tight. You found me, and now, are you going to take the child away? Are you going to have me escorted back to the capital so you and Emilia can humiliate me in front of everyone again? Cassius's brow twitched. He spoke, his voice carrying a weariness she'd never heard before, as if it had been dug up from the depths of the earth. Emilia isn't at the estate. She never has been. Lillian paused, then smiled. The smile was as cold as the snow outside. What's that? She doesn't want you anymore either. He didn't deny it. He simply stood there before her, the wind and snow howling behind him, his shadow stretched long by the firelight, casting itself over her entirely. 4 years had transformed her from a timid girl into a sharp, resilient woman, and had worn down that haughty duke into a silent man with a shadow of gray in his eyes. I've been looking for you for 4 years, he said, enunciating each word clearly. Every night I wondered if you were dead, if because of me you had died in some place no one knew about. Her eyelashes fluttered, but she quickly suppressed that brief flicker of emotion. She crossed her arms, leaned against the edge of the rough wooden table, and tilted her head to look at him, her gaze as if appraising an uninvited stranger. Well, now you've seen me, I'm not dead. I'm doing just fine. You can leave. Lillian. Don't call my name. She cut him off, her voice rising sharply. The flames in the fireplace leapt in fright. What right do you have to call my name? The woman in your bed 4 years ago was your wife's sister. Do you know what that means? There's nothing more disgusting in the entire kingdom. And you didn't even bother to give me an explanation. Get the hell out of here, as if I'm the one who's been disturbing you. By the end of her speech, her voice had taken on a trembling, sobbing edge. But she clenched her teeth tightly, refusing to let the tears fall. The only thing she'd learned in these 4 years was this: tears are useless. Tears won't make anyone stay, nor will they heal any wounds. During her first winter in the north, she lay on a cold bed with a high fever, 3 months pregnant, with not a single soul by her side. By the time she clawed her way back from the brink of death, she had already cried herself dry. As Cassius listened to her words, his face grew paler by the second, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles cracking. Every word she said was true. It was true. He had indeed done those things, said those words, and on that very night, crushed with his own hands the last chance he had to keep her. But he couldn't tell her the truth, not now at least. The stakes were too high. The old king's secret decree, the Blackwood family's blood curse, the power plays between Emilia and the royal family. That betrayal had been orchestrated from the very beginning, and he was trapped in a position from which he dared not break free. He had thought letting her go was protecting her. He thought she would return to her family home, find a place to settle down, and wait for him to resolve everything before he came to fetch her. He didn't know she was pregnant. No one had told him. I know nothing I say will matter, he began slowly, his voice low as if ground out from his chest. But the child is mine. Lorn, he is of the Blackwood bloodline. I cannot let him be cast out into the world. Lillian snapped to attention, as if pricked by a needle. A flash of genuine fear crossed her eyes. Not anger, but fear. You dare lay a finger on him, she said, her voice low and tight, like a string stretched to its limit. Cassius, haven't you ruined me enough? Do you want to take him away from me, back to that cold, lifeless estate, and raise him to be just like you? Cold, selfish, treating every emotion like a bargaining chip. I'd rather die than let you do that. Her chest heaved violently, and her hand reached for the knife on the table once more. This time she gripped it firmly, the blade pointing at him, casting a thin, cold glint in the firelight. Cassius looked down at the knife, then up at her face. His expression remained unchanged, but something deep within his eyes shattered. Very, very deep. You hate me that much, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. You make it sound as if it's strange that I hate you, she smiled, though her eyes were red. Cassius Blackwood, do you have any idea what my life has been like these past 4 years? When I fled that estate, I had nothing with me. I was carrying your child and couldn't even afford a carriage. I walked for 3 days and 3 nights before I managed to hitch a ride on a grain wagon. I washed dishes at a small tavern in exchange for a meal. But when the landlady found out I was pregnant, she threw me out, calling me a shameless woman. I slept in stables and ate stale bread that others had thrown away. Later I came here. The vicar in Everton was a kind man. He let me stay in the rectory for a month until I gave birth to Lorn. Her voice grew faster and faster, unstoppable like a mountain flood, as 4 years of pent-up emotions poured out. Do you know how painful it was to give birth to him? I screamed all night, with no one by my side but the midwife and an old nun who was deaf in one ear. I nearly died on that bed. I thought then, if I die, what will become of this child? He didn't even have a name, so I gave him a name, Lorn. That was my grandfather's name, and it has nothing to do with your Blackwood family. At this point, her hand finally began to tremble, and the blade wavered in the air. Her voice dropped so low, it was almost a whisper. He is all I have. You bound me to you with a marriage contract, froze me to ashes with your indifference, and pushed me off a cliff with your betrayal. And now, on what grounds do you stand here, reaching out to me and claiming he is yours? The room was silent for a long time. Only the crackling of wood in the fireplace and the howling of wind and snow outside could be heard. Cassius stood there, motionless. His face was half lit, half shadowed by the firelight, his eyelashes casting a shadow across his cheekbones. After a long time he slowly raised his hand, not to snatch the knife from her grasp, but to take hold of her wrist, gently, more gently than he had ever held anything in his life. He pointed the knife's tip at his own chest. Holding her trembling hand like that, he pressed the blade directly over his heart, through the fabric of his coat, through the ribs beneath his skin. If you think killing me will ease the pain of these past 4 years even a little, he said, looking down into her eyes, his voice as deep as the deepest toll of a bell in the night, then go ahead. Lillian's fingers froze. The tip of the knife sank into the black wool of his overcoat. She could feel the warmth radiating through the fabric. Hot. He was hot. This man, whom she had once thought as cold as stone, was, after all, warm too. Her tears finally began to fall. Silent, scalding hot. They fell one by one onto the hand that was gripping her wrist. She cried for a long time. Long enough for the fire in the hearth to burn from a blaze to a smolder, until all that remained was a layer of dark red embers flickering in the ashes. Long enough for the hand holding the knife to go completely limp, the blade slipping from her fingertips and clattering onto the stone floor. Cassius did not release her wrist, but held it just as it was, as if clutching something that would shatter the moment he let go. It wasn't as if he'd never seen a woman cry. Emilia had cried before him countless times, tear-streaked, pouting, aggrieved, each expression perfectly measured, as if performing a carefully rehearsed play on stage. But Lillian's tears were different. She wept without restraint, her face contorted, snot and tears running together in a mess, her body shaking like a sieve, as if she were turning her insides out to wash them clean. It wasn't a pretty sight, yet it felt as though someone had stabbed him in the chest. Lillian, he called her softly, his thumb nervously brushing the skin on the inside of her wrist. There was a thin scar there, an old wound, and he couldn't remember when she'd gotten it. In fact, he realized there was almost nothing he knew about her. He didn't know she was sensitive to the cold, didn't know she liked to roll her blanket into a tube when she slept, didn't know how much sugar she put in her tea. They had lived under the same roof for a whole year, and he didn't even know these things about her. She pushed him away, took 2 steps back, and roughly wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her eyes were red as a rabbit's. The tip of her nose was red as a rabbit's. She looked utterly disheveled, yet there was an unyielding stubbornness about her. "Don't touch me," Her voice still carried a hint of tears, but she was already trying to control herself. "Cassius, are you done? If you're done, then leave." "I won't leave," he said, bending down to pick up the knife from the floor, folding it and placing it on the table. His movements were slow, as if he were buying himself time to think. "At least not tonight. A blizzard is coming. Even if you hate me, you wouldn't want Lorn's father to freeze to death on your doorstep, would you?" Lillian's lips twitched. She looked out the window. The snow was indeed falling harder. The wind whipped the pine forest into a crowd of stooped old men, their howling making her scalp prickle. Having lived in the north for these past few years, she knew what spending a night out in this weather meant. She hated him, but she didn't want him to die. At least, not now. That thought made her hate herself even more. "One night," she said through clenched teeth, "you'll leave first thing tomorrow morning. You'll never show your face to me or Lorn again. Promise me that, and I'll let you stay by the fireplace for one night." Cassius didn't promise. He merely gave a slight nod, a gesture so ambiguous it could have been either agreement or a half-hearted concession. Then he took off his coat, hung it on the wooden hook by the door, crouched down in front of the fireplace, and tossed 2 logs onto the dying embers. The flames flared up again, illuminating the profile of his face. His eyelashes were long, glowing golden in the firelight. When they drooped, they looked like 2 rows of bars, locking everything inside tightly away. Lillian leaned against the door to the inner room, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him warily. Her posture was exactly the same as Lorn's had been moments ago when he'd been hiding behind her. Just then, the door to the inner room was pulled open a crack from the inside. Lorn's fuzzy little head poked through the crack again, one eye closed, the other peering out brightly. "Mommy, are you 2 done arguing?" he asked softly, his voice free of fear, filled only with curiosity. Lillian crouched down and ruffled his hair. "We're done. Why aren't you asleep yet?" Lorn didn't answer. His gaze swept past her shoulder and landed on the man standing by the fireplace. Cassius turned his head and met those eyes that were almost a carbon copy of his own. They stared at each other for 3 seconds. Then Lorn squeezed through the crack in the door, scuffed over to Cassius on his bare feet, tilted his little face upward, and scrutinized him from head to toe with the utmost seriousness. "You said you're my..." He furrowed his little brow, trying to recall the word he'd just heard. "Father." Caius's Adam's apple bobbed. "Yes, what's a father?" "It's..." He paused. This man, who could debate eloquently for 3 hours before the king, was stumped by a 3-year-old's question. "It's the person who, together with your mother, brought you into this world." Lorn tilted his head and thought for a moment, then reached out and poked Cassius's knee with a finger covered in cookie crumbs. "Then why aren't you with us? The fishmonger's dad in town is with him every day." The fire in the hearth crackled. Lillian leaned against the thin wooden door, one hand covering her mouth. She fought desperately to keep from crying again, for she had asked this question in her heart on Lorn's behalf countless times. "Why aren't you by my side? Why must I shoulder everything alone? Why must I bear the burden of your mistakes?" Cassius looked down at the tiny hand poking at his knee and remained silent for a long time. His jaw was taut as a string about to snap, and his breathing was slow and heavy, as if he were bearing some invisible weight. "Because," he finally spoke, his voice so low that only Lorn could hear it, "I did something very, very stupid. I drove your mother away. Every day since, I've regretted it." Lorn blinked. "What does regret feel like?" "It's like..." Cassius raised his hand, hesitated, then gently, almost cautiously, placed it on the back of Lorn's head. That hand, capable of single-handedly wielding a sword to fell a grown man, felt as light as if it were touching a butterfly's wing. "It's like walking for a very, very long time in the freezing snow, unable to find your way home. You know there's a warm fireplace and hot bread waiting for you, but you can't get inside, the door is shut. Lillian couldn't bear to listen any longer. She spun around abruptly, pulled open the inner door, and stepped inside. Leaning her back against the doorframe, she slid down to the floor, inch by inch. She gasped for air, one hand pressed against her chest, and tears once again streamed silently down her pale, malnourished face. The door to the inner room was thin, so thin that she could hear every sound from outside. The patter of Lorn's bare feet on the stone floor, the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth, and Cassius's deep voice, which cut right to her bones. He was answering Lorn's endless questions with a kind of almost clumsy patience she had never heard before. "What's this?" Lorn's voice, probably pointing at something. "A button on a coat. Why is it black?" "Because black hides dirt." "What does hides dirt mean?" "It means it doesn't get dirty easily." "Oh." There was a brief pause, then Lorn's voice again. "Then why are you kneeling on the floor the whole time?" Lillian froze. She pressed her face against the door and peered through the narrow crack. Cassius was indeed not sitting in a chair. He was now kneeling on one knee in front of the fireplace. Because Lorn was so short that if he sat down, his long legs would block the child's path. So the mighty Duke of Blackwood, commander of a third of the kingdom's army, was currently kneeling on one knee on the muddy floor of a rural stone cottage, maintaining eye level with a little tyke. His black trousers were dusted with a layer of grime, yet he seemed utterly unconcerned. Lillian buried her face in her knees and bit her lip hard. This scene was far too dangerous. It was 10,000 times more dangerous than the knife she'd held in her hand moments ago, because it would make her heart grow soft, and she couldn't let her heart grow soft. To do so would mean sticking her neck out once more, only to be cut down in the same way all over again. It was quiet outside for a moment. Lorn had probably finished asking his questions and was starting to get sleepy. His biological clock was always spot on, shutting down automatically at this hour. Sure enough, she heard Lorn let out a huge yawn and say in a muffled voice, "I'm sleepy. Don't go. I'll show you my rabbit tomorrow." "Okay," Cassius replied. Then came a rustling sound, likely as Lorn climbed into the small bed in the outer room. A little while later, footsteps approached the inner room and stopped on the other side of the door. She could feel his shadow pressing against the doorframe. "He's asleep," he whispered. She didn't answer. She wiped the tears from her face with her sleeve, stood up, and pulled the door open. Her movement was so sudden that Cassius's hand remained suspended in midair, as if he'd been about to knock. They stood face to face, separated by the width of a threshold, a distance that had once been the width of an entire bed, the very image she'd seen from outside of him, and Emilia's bodies entwined. "You've won," she said, her voice hoarse, but no longer trembling. "You've seen him, you know he's alive. Tomorrow you can go back and report. Tell the king, tell everyone, that the bloodline of the Blackwoods has not been lost. You can go back and be your duke in peace." Cassius looked down at her. The embers of the fire bathed half his face in warm orange, while the other half remained submerged in shadow, as if two different people had been pieced together. "Do you think I came to see you because of the king's orders? What else could it be?" She tugged at the corner of her mouth, the curve devoid of any trace of a smile. "Or did you come because you missed me?" She regretted the words the moment they left her lips, for Cassius's expression had shifted in those gray eyes, which had always resembled a frozen lake. Something she could not decipher suddenly welled up. He raised his hand as if to touch her face, but his fingers halted an inch from her cheek, hovering there, curling slightly, before finally withdrawing. "Yes," he said, just one word. No explanation, no embellishment, no defense. It was as brief as that "get out" from 4 years ago, but the force with which it struck her heart was the exact opposite. Lillian froze. Her mind seemed to get stuck on that single word. All thought ceased for a second. Then she summoned every ounce of strength to suppress those unwelcome emotions, pushing them down to the deepest recesses of her heart, and covering them with layer upon layer of ice. "Save it," she said, turning her face away, her voice turning cold. "Cassius, people like you don't understand what feelings are. All you understand is power, self-interest, and how to place people exactly where you need them. You've never needed anyone. You only need pawns." He said nothing. The silence felt like a wall. "You're not going to argue." She couldn't help but turn and glance at him. "You have a point," he said, his voice calm. "At least 4 years ago, you were right." His reply left her at a loss for words. She was used to confrontation, used to arguments, used to putting up defenses. She had even prepared herself for a huge fight with him. But he didn't argue. He just stood there, taking all her accusations in stride and admitting that a large part of them was true. It felt like punching a bag of cotton. That helplessness made her incredibly frustrated. "I'll sleep in the outer room," he said, turning toward the chair by the fireplace, which was so small that when he sat down, his knees nearly touched his chest. He took his coat off the wooden hook, draped it over himself, and closed his eyes. Lillian stared at him for a long while, then turned and walked into the inner room, closing the door behind her. She didn't lock it. She told herself she'd forgotten, but deep down she knew it wasn't that. The next morning, she was awakened by Lorn's laughter. It was a sound she knew all too well, clear, carefree, like a spring splashing against stone. But the moment she opened her eyes, she sensed something was wrong, because at this time of day, Lorn would usually be perched at the head of the bed, poking her face with his cold little hands to wake her up, not laughing out there. She sat up abruptly, threw on some clothes, and pushed open the door to the inner room. Then she saw a scene that made her heart stop. Cassius was crouched by the doorway, his coat off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, holding a wood-chopping axe as he split a piece of pine so thick it was frightening. His movements were precise. With a single swing of the axe, the wood split cleanly in two, each half as even as if measured with a ruler. And Lorn was crouched beside him, holding a fluffy rabbit with one ear missing, her eyes sparkling with wonder. "Mom." Lorn jumped up excitedly when she came out. "Dad said he can chop that tree into 100 pieces. He's so amazing." Lillian stood in the doorway, her hand still gripping the doorframe. The snow had stopped outside. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the clouds, falling on the pine branches covered in a thick layer of white. The light so pure it was almost blinding. Cassius straightened up, a bead of sweat on his temple, the white mist of his breath dispersing in the cold air. He turned his head to look at her, his lips moving slightly, but before he could speak, he was interrupted by another sound. The sound came from the direction of the path, the clatter of hooves, not just one horse, but a whole squadron. The iron hooves pounded the slushy snow, a dull, rhythmic thud with the kind of precision only a disciplined military unit could produce. Cassius's brow had furrowed the moment he heard the first clatter of hooves. He set down his axe and shielded Lorn behind him with one hand, the movement as natural as if he'd done it 1,000 times. His body leaned forward slightly, the muscles in his shoulders taut, like a hound that had caught the scent of danger. The Imperial Duke's alertness snapped back into place in an instant. Lillian heard it too. Her face went pale. The hoofbeats stopped in front of the stone house. A gruff voice shouted from outside, "Northern Garrison, by His Majesty the King's 3rd decree, we are searching the entire realm of Everton to apprehend the remnants of the rebels." People inside opened the door. Cassius's gaze turned completely cold the moment he heard the words "His Majesty's 3rd Royal Decree." He turned to glance at Lillian, his eyes holding a sharpness she had never seen before, not directed at her, but at the men outside. "Is there a back door here?" he asked in a low voice. Lillian shook her head, her throat tightening. There's only the front door. His jaw tensed, and then he did something she never expected. He picked up his coat from the floor and draped it over her shoulders. His fingers paused for a second at her collar and fastened the top button. She had sewn that button on 4 years ago, but he had never touched it before. Take Lorn into the inner room. Close the door. Don't come out until you hear my voice. His tone was eerily calm, as if he were setting up the opening moves of a chess game. No matter what happens out there, don't come out. Do you hear me, Cassius? Do you hear me? He repeated, his voice lower and heavier this time, leaving her no room to argue. Lorn was startled by her tone and burrowed into her arms, clutching the rabbit, his tiny body trembling. Lillian clenched her teeth, picked up the child, and went into the inner room, closing the door behind her. Through the crack in the door, she saw Cassius walk to the wooden door, straighten his collar, and then open it. Sunlight poured in from behind him, casting a long shadow across the floor inside. He stood in the doorway, shoulders straight, head held slightly high. That innate air of nobility instantly overshadowed the man who had just been crouched on the ground splitting wood. This was not the Cassius she knew, nor the Cassius Lorn knew. This was the Duke of Blackwood for the outside world to see. Since when does the North Watch bypass the Lord to enforce the king's edicts? His voice was not loud, but every word carried a weight that commanded respect without anger. Everton is freehold territory, not under the jurisdiction of the garrison. Who is your commander? There was a 2-second silence outside the door. Then the gruff voice spoke in a noticeably softer tone. You are Blackwood, he said, stating his surname in a flat tone that felt like a thunderclap. A flurry of commotion followed. Armor clanged, footsteps retreated, and someone muttered a panicked, Your Grace, forgive us. Cassius didn't spare them a second glance. He simply shut the door. He turned, leaned against the door, and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked toward the inner room. He knew Lillian was watching from behind the door. He knew she had heard everything. The king's decree isn't aimed at the rebels, he whispered, gazing through the crack in the door. It's aimed at you. The room was silent for a full 5 seconds. Then the inner door swung open. Lillian stood in the doorway, holding Lorn in her arms. Her face was as white as the snow outside, but the fire in her eyes had reignited. She stared straight at him, her lips trembling slightly, yet her voice was unusually clear. Who on earth did I marry? Lillian stood in the doorway, holding Lorn in her arms. His little face was buried in the crook of her neck, and he was already starting to doze off. Her fingers dug tightly into the child's back, her knuckles turning white. The king's decree isn't aimed at the rebels. It's aimed at you, she repeated his words, her voice low, as if she were trying to tear each syllable apart, crush it, and swallow it, to taste what it was like. It tasted bitter, more bitter than any bowl of herbal soup she'd ever drunk in the north. She lifted her head. The tears in her eyes had dried, replaced by something harder. Say that again. Cassius walked back from the doorway. His coat was still draped over her shoulders. His own shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, the collar slightly open, revealing a faint pink gold scar on his collarbone. He walked to the rough wooden table, braced his hands on the surface, and bowed his head, as if sorting through something very long. Then he spoke. Your last name isn't Morton, he said. Lillian's expression went blank for a second. What did you say? Your mother's name isn't Anna Morton. Morton isn't your father. You're Violet Everton's daughter. Your real last name is Everton. The name struck her like a stone thrown into a calm lake. Lillian's body swayed, and her back slammed against the doorframe. Everton, wasn't that the name of a small town? She had fled here precisely because the name felt strangely familiar, like a lullaby she'd heard in a dream. She'd thought it was a coincidence, a final act of mercy from fate. The Everton family. Cassius's voice continued, as steady as a military briefing, the oldest guardians of the North. Legend has it that the blessing of the old gods flows through their veins, enabling the land to yield grain in the depths of winter and allowing dying livestock to rise and run again. The truth of this legend is unclear, but every king throughout the ages has believed it. Your grandfather, Marcus Everton, was the last Earl of Everton. 18 years ago, the old king executed his entire family on charges of collusion with the enemy and treason. He paused for a moment, then looked up at her. Your mother survived because someone hid her. A merchant named Morton, the man you've called father for the past 18 years, took your mother south, married her under a false identity, and fathered you. When you were 2, your mother died of illness. Morton raised you until you turned 18, when the king's men found him. Lillian's lips were trembling. She didn't want to hear any more, but her feet felt as if they were nailed to the floor. She couldn't move a step. Lorn, in her arms, mumbled something in his sleep, his little hand loosening its grip on the rabbit's ear before clenching it again. The king found Morton and ordered him to hand you over. Cassius straightened, walked around the table, and took a step toward her. His gray eyes looked pale in the morning light, as if washed with water. Malton refused, so the king pinned an identical charge on him, treason and collaboration. He died on the gallows, never revealing where you were. She remembered. On that rainy day, the gallows stood in the town square. Dragged there by her father's apprentice, she'd been hidden at the back of the crowd, her mouth covered, tears streaming down her face. She'd watched the man who'd raised her have the noose slipped over his neck, seen the plank beneath his feet kicked away, and watched his body swing in the air. She'd always thought it was fate's cruelty. It turned out, from start to finish, it was all because of her blood. You, her voice squeezed out of her throat, hoarse as sandpaper. How did you know? Cassius stopped right in front of her. They were less than an arm's length apart. He looked down at her, his gaze devoid of pity, guilt, or any emotion she recognized. There was only a heavy, unyielding resolve. Because I was there. Her pupils contracted sharply. Not at the execution, he added quickly, his voice dropping a few notches. The night before, after my father died on the battlefield, I inherited the title. I was 19 that year, summoned to the royal council for the first time. The king pointed at me in front of everyone and said, "You Blackwood boy, you will repay the debt your father owed." He ordered me to find a girl, the last of the Everton line. To find her, marry her, and hold the wedding on Everton's lands. Only by uniting the bloodlines of the Blackwoods and the Evertons would the old god's blessing be activated. He didn't just want the grain from this land. He wanted more. He wanted immortality. The room was so quiet, you could hear the embers crackling in the fireplace. Lillian felt her blood running cold, from her fingertips to her heart, from her heart to the soles of her feet. She opened her mouth, but the voice that came out was unrecognizable even to herself. "So you married me because of the king's command." He didn't speak. That was his admission. "You know who I am. That day at the town fair, you weren't just passing by chance. You'd been looking for me for a long time, hadn't you? The flower girl, the girl hiding in the corner eating black bread. She remembered your kindness for the rest of her life. Countless times in her dreams, she returned to that afternoon when you bent down and asked her name, and she told you, and you said, 'That's a beautiful name.'" Cassius's Adam's apple bobbed violently. "It's a beautiful name," she repeated the words, a smile twisting at the corners of her mouth, a grimace uglier than tears. "I was 18 then. I thought it was love. I fucking thought it was love. But from start to finish, I was nothing more than a pawn on your chessboard. A mission." It wasn't like that 4 years ago. His voice suddenly changed, no longer steady, no longer calm, as if a crack had finally appeared in a wall, letting scalding magma surge out from beneath. "That night 4 years ago when you left, I sat alone in my study with a sheet of paper spread out before me, a personal letter from the king, bearing the royal seal, which read, "Activate the bloodline. On the night of the full moon, immerse her blood in the holy spring of Everton. Once complete, bring her back to the capital, where the royal blood mage will take over the rest." His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles cracking. "Do you know what the rest means? The blood mages would tie her to a stone slab, cut open her veins, and drain her blood drop by drop, pouring it into the king's veins. They'd keep her alive, because when a person dies, their blood grows cold. They'd keep her alive in that state until the very last drop. That is the immortality he desires." Lillian's face drained of all color. She instinctively clutched Lorn tighter. The child let out a whimper from the pressure and drifted back to sleep. "I tore up that letter," Cassius said. "That night I told you the truth. Only that truth was a lie I made up. I knew how you felt about me. I knew you'd rather be hurt by me 100 times than let me touch your blood. So I enlisted Emilia. She was the only one willing to help me. Not because of any connection between us, but because her husband, the man she truly loved, was being held hostage in the king's dungeon. She knew her husband would die if this plan was exposed, but she helped me anyway." He reached out and slowly, almost cautiously, placed his hand on her shoulder. Through the fabric of her coat, she could feel the warmth of his palm. This time she didn't pull away. Not because she didn't want to, but because she no longer had the strength. "I'd rather you hate me for the rest of your life than let the king find any loophole. If you flee the capital because of a husband's infidelity, it's a marital scandal. The nobles will merely laugh it off, and the king won't pursue it further. But if you run after learning the truth, that's treason. He'll use every means at his disposal to hunt you down. 4 years ago, I didn't have the power to protect you. I was only 20 back then. Half of my father's forces were in the king's hands. I couldn't even mobilize my own guard." He paused, took a deep breath, and the hands that had once gripped swords, tamed horses, and signed countless military orders trembled slightly. "Things are different now. These past 4 years, I haven't just been searching for you. I've also been building an army. I've replaced 30% of the garrison in the north with my own men. I've plucked every single one of the king's spies he planted around Everton. I'd planned to come for you this spring, but the king moved faster than I anticipated." Lillian slowly raised her hand and pushed his away from her shoulder. The gesture was gentle, devoid of hatred or anger. Her eyes seemed hollowed out, leaving only a thin shell. "You're right," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "The story is complete. The logic clear, the motive sound, and every detail is flawless. You've even found me a grand justification. You weren't betraying me, you were protecting me. Every single thing you did to hurt me was because you loved me." She smiled. The smile was so cold it made the embers in the fireplace dim. "But why should I believe you? You told me you married me because of the king's command. You just admitted it yourself. From start to finish, I've been nothing more than a mission in your eyes. Now you're using a new, more complex mission to cover up the old one. What's the difference? Really? Why should I believe a single word you say?" With that, she turned and walked into the inner room, closing the door behind her. This time, she locked it. The moment the latch clicked into place, Cassius stood in the morning light of the outer room, all expression draining from his face until only a weariness bordering on despair remained. He slowly crouched down, picked up the half-split piece of pine from the floor, and held it in his hand, examining it for a long time. Then, he placed it in the fireplace. The flames reignited, casting their light upon his face. After the door clicked shut, the outer room remained silent for a long time. Cassius didn't knock. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't do any of the things he usually would. He simply stood in front of the closed door, raised his hand, his fingertips an inch from the wood, then lowered it. Lillian didn't see this. The door was already locked. She sat on the floor with her back against it, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes wide as she stared at the crack in the opposite wall, stained brown by the passage of time. Her mind was a cacophony. Two voices were fighting. One said, those details couldn't possibly be made up. Everton, Holy Spring, Blood Mage. She'd never heard those names in her life. The other said, he's the Empire's youngest Duke, a man who's managed to survive the labyrinth of power in the capital. He's better at lying than you are at telling the truth. Have you forgotten? She heard Lorn roll over in bed. The blanket slid to the floor. She stood up to tuck it back around him, then looked down at his face for a moment. His eyebrows were like his lips were like his. Even his habit of furrowing his brow slightly in his sleep was like his. She had once tried to find traces of herself in Lorn, to find evidence that he didn't belong to the Blackwood family. But she had failed. She had given birth to his entire shadow through the pain he had inflicted upon her. A faint sound came from the fireplace. Not the crackling of firewood, but the rustle of fabric, as if someone had stood up and sat back down. Then she heard the sound of a latch turning. Not the lock on the inner door, but the front door. He was opening the door. He was leaving. Lillian's body acted before her mind could catch up. She yanked the door open and rushed out, only to find Cassius already standing in the snow outside. Coatless, his shirt sleeves still rolled up to his elbows, a short knife drawn from his bootleg in his hand. He wasn't leaving. He'd heard something. Come inside, he said, without turning his head. Then she heard it too. Not the sound of hooves, but footsteps this time. The sound of many, many feet trampling the snow, closing in from all directions, as if someone were pulling in an invisible net. Cassius took a step back, shut the door behind her with a backhand, and bolted it from the outside. She heard the sound of an iron bolt being drawn across the door. A device the merchant from Morton had installed himself years ago, originally meant to keep out wild animals. Cassius, she pounded on the door, but there was no answer from the other side. She peered through the crack in the door. The midday sun glinting off the snow made her squint, and then she saw them, emerging from the pine forest, sliding down the frozen river's surface, rising from behind snow, covered bushes like ghosts rising from the ground. Their armor was not the black iron of the North's garrison, but a dark, oily crimson, like dried blood. Each wore a golden ribbon wrapped around his left arm, a sign of direct royal service, a member of the Blood Guard. She recognized the man leading the group, tall and gaunt, with a hooked nose and cheekbones sharp as blades. His sparse hair was combed back, revealing a broad, gleaming forehead. Gran Morris, the judge from the capital. On the night she left the Duke's mansion 4 years ago, this man had been waiting in a carriage outside. He had been waiting for the Everton orphan that Cassius would hand over once she had stormed off in a rage. He hadn't gotten his chance then, but now he was here. Gran stopped 10 paces from the stone cottage. He pulled his cloak tighter and gave Cassius a slight bow. The angle of that bow was measured, neither disrespectful nor concealing his contempt. Your Grace, his voice was thin and shrill, like a needle scraping against glass. The winter in the north is truly a difficult journey. I've ridden all the way from the capital, and 3 horses have died along the way, only to arrive and find that someone actually beat me here. Might you tell me, Your Grace, what brings you to Everton? To inspect my domain. Cassius stood in the snow before the door, a dagger in one hand, the other hanging naturally at his side. His tone was exactly the same as when he had been chopping wood inside the house. The Duke of Blackwood has the right to enter his own domain at any time. That is Section 2 of Article 3 of the Kingdom's laws. Surely, Magistrate Gran isn't unaware of that. Gran smiled, though the smile did not spread to any other part of his chiseled face. Of course I know the law. But there is also Article 4. The King's direct guard has the authority to override a lord's jurisdiction when holding a royal warrant. I have a 3rd edict here, he said, pulling a scroll of parchment from his bosom and twirling it between his fingers. It authorizes me to search the entire territory of Everton for the remnants of the Everton rebels who defected 4 years ago. Surely His Grace the Duke wouldn't stand in my way. A search warrant is a search warrant, not an arrest warrant. You may search if you wish, but which room you search and which person you search requires my countersignature. Well, that's a coincidence. Gran tucked the parchment into his sleeve and smiled even more broadly. I've just received intelligence that the woman in this room is the last surviving bloodline of the Everton family. So I'm not here to search. I'm here to make an arrest. Your Grace, please step aside. The snow had started falling again. Not the blinding blizzard of the north, but a fine, dense flurry of snowflakes that struck his face at an angle like countless tiny needles. Cassius stood there, a thin layer of white settling on his shoulders. Step aside, he repeated the word, then suddenly smiled. It was different from the smile he'd given Lorn inside the room moments ago, and different from the one he'd given her at their wedding 4 years prior. It was the smile of a warrior, standing at the entrance to the battlefield, carrying a certain cold, reckless composure. Glenn, how many men did you bring? 36. Is that enough? Not enough. No sooner had the words left his mouth than Cassius's dagger had already flown from his hand. That blade did not fly toward Gran. The judge was a civil official. Killing him would serve no purpose. The dagger spun through the snowy curtain, driving itself precisely into the shoulder blade of the adjutant, standing to Gran's right rear. The adjutant let out a scream. The longsword in his hand fell to the snow, creating a crimson pool in the white. In the same instant, Cassius sidestepped 2 scimitars swinging at him from the left, grabbed one of the attacker's wrists with one hand, and twisted it with a single sharp motion. The sound of shattering bones echoed muffled through the snow. Lillian saw it all through the crack in the door. She pressed her hand tightly over her mouth to stifle a scream. She had seen him gentle. She had seen him cold. She had seen him kneel on the ground and patiently answer every one of Lorn's questions. But she had never seen him fight. The Cassius of this moment was not a man, but a siege engine set free from its chains. Every slash landed on the most lethal spot. Every punch struck the joints, precise and ruthless, without a single wasted movement. Under his blade, those 36 blood guards looked like 36 scarecrows. But scarecrows don't grow flesh and blood. The blood guards do. By the time the 17th fell, Cassius's left arm bore 3 new wounds. The deepest one was on the outer side of his forearm, the skin and flesh torn open, exposing the underlying fascia. The sleeve of his white shirt had already been stained a deep red with blood. He took 2 steps back, leaning his back against the stone wall of the house, breathing heavily, the white vapor he exhaled resembling the smoke from a steam engine's chimney. The knife in his hand was one he had seized. The hilt was covered in someone else's blood. He was still standing, but his stance was no longer as steady as it had been. Gran stood outside the fray, not having moved a single step from start to finish. He watched his men fall one by one in the snow, his face devoid of expression, as if a master were taking inventory of expendable goods. The Duke's reputation is well deserved. He clapped his hands, the sound jarring against the silence of the battlefield. But as you can see, I have 19 men left. How many more can you field? 5, 10. I doubt you can even hold out with 3. I'll hold out even if I can't. Cassius's voice was hoarse, but his tone showed not a hint of wavering. Because you'll never set foot through that door. Ah, speaking of doors. Gran's gaze swept past Cassius's shoulder to the wooden door of the stone house, and he suddenly narrowed his eyes. He saw the sliver of light filtering through the crack, and the small shadow obscured by that light. Someone was standing behind the door. That child is inside, isn't it? His voice suddenly grew soft and gentle, as if asking about some trivial matter of daily life. I've heard some rather interesting news. When the Duchess left 4 years ago, it said she was already with child. Has the child been born? Boy or girl? Who does it take after? In that instant, Cassius's body froze completely. This was the moment Gran had been waiting for. He gently raised 2 fingers and pressed them down silently. From the roof, a blood guard who had been crouched behind the chimney suddenly rolled forward and leaped down, wrapping an arm around Cassius's neck. His knife fell into the snow. 2 others rushed in from either side, each seizing an arm and pinning him firmly against the iron bolt on the door. Guran strolled leisurely toward him, bent down, and picked up the knife that had fallen from his hand. He lifted Cassius's chin with the tip of the blade, forcing him to look up at him. "Did you really think I'd brought only 36 men? How could I possibly not have a backup plan when facing the Duke of Blackwood? The man on the roof is one of mine. He's been lying there watching for quite some time. You looked charming chopping wood, and you looked charming crouching on the ground soothing a child. That boy, oh, he looks just like you. Congratulations, Your Grace. Not only did you help me find Everton's orphan, but you also threw in a Blackwood bloodline as a bonus." Cassius's eyes turned into 2 bottomless pools of black. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Yet Lillian could read his words. He was saying, "Run." Inside the doorway, Lillian stumbled back a step. Her legs were weak, her hands were trembling, and her whole body felt frozen in fear, unable to move. Then she heard Lorn's voice, coming from the inner room muffled and soft with sleep. "Mommy, why is it so noisy out there?" In that instant, all the fear within Lillian was crushed by something more powerful than fear itself. She turned and rushed into the inner room, scooping up Lorn, who was still rubbing his eyes, and clutching him tightly to her chest. Her mind raced, quickly scanning every possible hiding spot and every escape route in the stone house. The loose plank in the corner of the north wall. The merchant from Morton had taught her years ago that if pursuers came, she should pry open the plank. Beneath it lay the entrance to a cellar. The cellar wasn't deep, but it connected to a hidden ditch leading to the back mountain. She knelt on one knee, holding Lorn in one arm while frantically prying at the plank with the other. Her fingernails snapped, and blood seeped through the cracks between her fingers. But she felt no pain. The plank gave way, and a chill of damp earth rose from below. Outside, Gran's voice pierced through the wooden door, as thin and shrill as ever. "Open the door, I'll count to 3. 1, 2. Then, a whistling sound cut through the air, drowning out everything else. It was not a knife, nor a sword, but a heavier, duller sound, as if it were tearing the sky in 2. It was a crossbow bolt, not an ordinary one, but a heavy siege bolt, with a shaft as thick as an adult's wrist and a head glinting with a bluish chill. It flew from the other side of the pine forest, crossing the entire battlefield, and drove itself precisely into the trunk of the old spruce tree in front of the stone house. Penetrating 3 feet deep, tied to the shaft was a small black flag, its surface embroidered with a design, a white falcon with outstretched wings, the Blackwood family's battle standard. From deep within the pine forest, the sound of hooves, so orderly it sent a chill down one's spine, surged forward like a tidal wave. Not a dozen, not a few dozen, but hundreds. 1,000 black horses emerged slowly from the shadows of the pine forest. Every rider wore black armor, identical to Cassius's, with the white falcon crest embossed on their breastplates. Their visors were uniformly lowered, their faces hidden. All that could be seen were rows of gleaming lances, held level in perfect unison, their tips aimed at every blood guard in front of the stone house. At the very front of the formation, a white horse stepped slowly out of line. Upon its back sat a woman, draped in a thick, dark green cloak. The hood of the cloak was thrown back, revealing a gaunt, angular face. Her hair was steel gray, braided into a thick plait at the nape of her neck. Fine lines etched the corners of her eyes, and her lips were as thin as a knife's edge. Her eyes were identical to Cassius's, a rare, cold gray, and at that moment they burned with a dangerous fury. Margaret Blackwood, Cassius's aunt, the true matriarch of the Blackwood family. She had commanded 3 victories against overwhelming odds during the border wars, and was known among the nobility as the Iron Widow. Because she had been married 3 times, had lost 3 husbands, each of whom had died on the battlefield, and had never shed a single tear herself. Gran Morris. Margaret's voice was not loud, but every word was driven into the snow, making the withered grass tremble. Who did you just say you wanted to open the door for you?